Now we continue with the program. What does a leader look like? Are women or men better able to run a country or a company? Understanding the perceptions and prejudices of people throughout our societies is essential to progress in equality. Today, we are proud to present the third edition of the Reykjavik Index for Leadership, a project done in cooperation between women political leaders and Kantar. The index measures popular perceptions on the suitability of both women and men for leadership positions across more than 20 sectors. Let's turn now to conversationists Atsushi Sunami, Hafsat Abiola, Hiltrud Werner and Michelle Harrison for more on these shifting perceptions.
Well, hello everyone. It's Michelle Harrison here from Kantar. I'm talking to you from London, where I'm in a completely deserted boardroom. Hannah Silvana, lovely to be back in Reykjavik with you, even albeit virtually. So it's a real privilege to join my panelists today, Hiltrud Werner, member of the board of Volkswagen in Germany, and Hafsat Abiola joining us, well, often from Nigeria, but today I believe from Brussels. And Hafsat has been the president of Women in Africa since 2018, a global platform dedicated to the economic development and support of leading and high potential African women. And also delighted to have Dr. Atsushi Sunami from Japan, where he is the president of the Ocean Policy Research Institute at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. So absolutely delighted to be sharing this platform today with our wonderful panelists. So this session, which is a real privilege to be able to chair, is called Power as Perceived, Societal Prejudice and its Effects on Leadership. And it's going to run in two parts. First of all, I'm going to do a little bit of context, sharing with you the latest findings from the 2020 version of the Reykjavik Index for Leadership. That's going to take a few minutes, and then I'll be welcoming my panelists into a conversation where we'll be drawing on their lived experience, and also all of them are global experts on issues of gender and inequality, and we'll be discussing the findings in the context of the Reykjavik Index. So, turning now then to the next few minutes to to the data I want to share with you on the Reykjavik Index for Leadership. So, as you've heard, and for those of you who've been in Reykjavik before now, we launched the index in 2018, and it was a partnership and remains a partnership between Kantar, women political leaders, and also we've been delighted to have the support of the government of Iceland. And we set up the index out of recognition that there was a gap missing in the evidence of what it was that constrained women on their journey to leadership. And there's a lot of data out there that helps us understand the outcomes for women in leadership and inequality in pay or in representation. But what there wasn't was an understanding of how society perceived women leaders. Next slide, please. And so in 2018, we created the Reykjavik Index for Leadership as a measure of how women and men are viewed in terms of their suitability for leadership. And there are a number of things to know about this. It's first of all, it's a measure of how people perceive men and women across the whole of society. It's not an assessment of what business leaders think or what professionals think. It's an assessment of what populations, whole populations think. And we launched the index back in 2018 for the G7. Today, I'll be sharing some findings again for the G7, but we're also very pleased to have been able to bring in some new countries this year and to share that baseline. But just across the G7, we have this year talked to 14,000 participants to understand their viewpoints, their perceptions of men and women in terms of their suitability for leadership. A couple of other things. We look across multiple different sectors. This isn't just about politics, isn't just about certain parts of the economy. We look across 23 sectors, and I do please encourage everyone, if they get a chance, do download the report from the Women Political Leaders Forum website, where you'll be able to get into the data in detail. And the other thing that's very important is that the index doesn't just look at prejudice against women. It looks at prejudice against men and women if it exists, so that we are able to measure it very holistically. Next slide, please. And so the way the index works, it's really very straightforward. Across all the countries where we do research, we ask a series of questions of people across all of those different sectors. And we ask them, for this particular sector, for this particular job, do you think a woman is more suitable for leadership? A man is more suitable for leadership? Or actually it doesn't matter? And the way that index works is the more that people say they don't really mind, that men and women are viewed as equal from their point of view, the higher the score on the Reykjavik index. So we give each country a score of between 0 and 100. Now, 100 doesn't mean anything other than equality. It meant that when asked that question, people shrugged their shoulders and said, it's equal. It doesn't really matter whether it's a man or a woman in a position of leadership. So what I'm going to do now is just ask for the slide to build and show you what the Reykjavik Index overall average score is for the G7 for 2020. And as you can see, it's 73. So a couple of things about that score. First of all, it sounds like a big number, but what it is, it's a measure of the equality gap. 100 means equality. 100 means women and men are equally viewed as being suitable to lead. Everything under that is an equality gap. So the metaphor would be if you were driving along in a car and men and women were driving along to a destination and it's a 100-kilometer journey, you're doing equally, doing fine until you hit kilometer 73, and then women hit a wall of prejudice. That would be the metaphor for what this tells us. The other thing to note is, for those of you who have been at Reykjavik before, that number might look familiar to you, and it is, because what we've actually seen is no movement year to year. That was the score also for 2019. Next slide, please. And so a few other points about this year's data. As before, we've seen the G7 group split into two different groups. We have a higher group, the UK, Canada, USA and France, who over the 3 years that we've tracked this have had higher scores, and then another group, another cluster, Italy, Japan and Germany, and obviously really looking forward to Hiltrud and Dr. Sunami's views on the positioning of Japan and Germany. Two important changes. Britain had dropped last year. It's come back up to a higher position, is back at the top of the G7 group, and Germany has actually dropped and has moved below Germany. And if we can just build, please. It's also great to be able to share some findings. India, we looked at last year too, again, no change there. And for the very first time, being able to share baseline data from Kenya and Nigeria, and obviously looking forward to Hafsat views on her reflections on that data. So a couple of points just before I close, if we can move to the next slide. As before, this remains a core finding, this idea of dissonance between men and women. So on the one hand, women and men are both complicit in prejudice against women as leaders. Women also tend to, and do across the G7, every country that we've done the research on, do give men greater emphasis in terms of their suitability for leadership than women. But in every country that we look at, women score higher. Women are more progressive, a little more supportive of women as being suitable for leaders than men are overall. That's a consistent score across 3 years. Next slide. And this is a pretty sobering point that I wanted to make. It's very easy with this kind of data to expect big changes year on year. And actually, generally, you don't see that in social trends. But what I did really want to flag is just how stagnant this data is, that we aren't seeing any progression at all over 3 years. We tend to live in an era at the moment where we feel that history is moving very fast. In actual fact, when it comes to prejudice and the perceptions of women in terms of their suitability for leadership, since we started tracking the data, we have seen no real change. And I'm going to ask now for the last slide, which is the one which is sobering. And actually in a week at which we've all, I'm sure, experienced so much joy about a woman vice president being elected in the US, this is a very sobering piece of data. So over the last 3 years, we have looked at our data, and remember, this is across a group of 14,000 across the G7. We have looked to see if there were patterns between age and perception. And what we often expect is that young people will come through with more progressive ideas that time will heal entrenched social problems. But what we do have to say is this year, and it's for the first time we've seen it, we've actually seen that younger people, and in particular younger men, are less progressive than the older cohorts within the data set. This is just a first data point. We need to do a lot more work on it, but this is a very sobering piece of analysis that suggests our younger people are coming through carrying significant prejudice in the way that they look at leadership and female suitability for it. So that's my last slide, and I'm really looking forward now to turning to the panel to talk to them. So if we can just see the last slide, please. So I'm going to introduce the panel again now, bring them into the conversation, and really what we want to do is to address this issue of, in light of this kind of sobering data and everything that is going on in the world, how do we address this degree of inequality and the degree of prejudice that constrains the journey that women can make into leadership. So Hiltrud, if I may start with you, and you and I have talked about these findings before, and in particular about Germany. So when we look at the data for this year, we see a slight deterioration in the position for Germany and also across the G7. What do you think might be lying behind this lack of progress?
Well, yes, thanks, Michelle. I think it's obvious that the share of women in leading positions and also in parts of Europe at the moment is shrinking instead of growing. And of course, that is concerning. And partly we put this down to the COVID-19 crisis. And at the same time, before becoming too negative, I must say that there are also positive examples. If you look, for example, at the huge German company SAP, where you have 50% women in the supervisory board, or even at Volkswagen, in our company, the share of women in leadership has grown slowly but steady and is constantly still increasing. I think we see not enough drive from the public sector to become a role model for the private industry at the moment. That's at least my impression. And I think we have to start a process here. The situation we also see in the Albright report, where the number of board seats taken by women in Germany is lower than it was a year ago.
Thank you, Hiltrud. And obviously, it's frustrating to see things not be appearing to move forward. But could I turn to you now, please, Dr. Sunami? And the Japanese situation has fascinated and sort of, been difficult for me to understand what the barriers are that you think are standing in the way of Japan when it comes to, I suppose, releasing a society from some of the apparent prejudices that it holds. So it'd be really helpful to hear your reflections on the data, how it rings true to you, and your thoughts about where this comes from.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, I'm rather a very difficult position in a way that we are able to host the WPL summit last year for the first time in Japan, in Asia. And I was really happy to see the progress of, as in the case of Germany, that there is some sense of advance and change that we see in Japan in terms of advancing and empowering women leadership in our society. But unfortunately, of course, if you look at this index, that progress, of course, is not enough. And the fact that we are just under the COVID and crisis, the pandemic, that the sense of uncertainty that in Japan that is really looking for a kind of leadership that are more assuring and more experienced and other qualities that people look at the leadership. Just that couldn't really have that match with the sort of the sense of woman leadership that would bring out to assure that sort of at the time of the uncertainty, people tends to be more conservative in a way that how much can we have asked the kind of leadership that the female leadership that we can really wanted to see and to have a very assertive and take the kind of decisions that are very difficult. And because we have a long history and culture of patriarchal sort of whether, you know, you have associated with a male leadership as such for that long with the culture and the history in particularly Asian context. And then to see whether female leadership can really to have the kind of association with that kind of quality of leadership is very difficult at the time of the uncertainty. And I think that became very unfortunate. But although, as in the case of Germany, we see some progress of having more male sort of understanding the role of woman and female in our society. And because of the COVID, everybody is now almost staying home and realizing it's important to share the kind of work that we do at home with a raising child and taking care of the household items and so on and so forth, that we can divide with the male and then other things. So these are things, are new things that are coming out as a positive impact on the kind of issues that we're dealing with because of the COVID. But unfortunately, when it comes to the leadership, that's something that is very still hard because of the uncertainty situation.
So it seems like something of a vicious cycle, really, that because women haven't held those positions, they're not being viewed as being capable of holding those positions, which is something obviously that we've talked about, at length at Reykjavik. This issue of you can't be what you can't say.
Exactly.
Hafsat, yes. Can I come to you now? And first time we've been able to create data for Nigeria or for Kenya. And as I said, sort of jokingly at the beginning, you're often in Nigeria. Today you're actually in Brussels, but I would be really pleased to get your view on that, the first set of data, but also where the value might sit in having that kind of baseline.
So let me just say that it's always a pleasure to be involved in anything that Silvana creates and drives. She's so amazing. And this forum is needed because of what it will do to boost women's leadership and male support for women's leadership. And I also want to say that the report which I've read is excellent. So well done, Michelle.
Thank you.
In terms of the question you asked, I think what I want to say when I read your report, when I listened also to your presentation, is that it's a report that makes the case for affirmative action, for quotas. Consider that in your report, you showed that when asked about the level of comfort with women leadership in Kenya, it was 40% that have that expressed that they would be comfortable to have women's leadership as an average across all the respondents. For Nigeria, it was 44%. It was more in Nigeria. But in Kenya, the number of women in government is 23%, based on the new constitution that they've just adopted. I think it was just maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And in Nigeria, it's 5.3%, one of the lowest on the continent, because we're still using a constitution from the 1980s. So there's actually a process right now to try to get laws in place that would support affirmative action. And the legislators are like, no, it's bad it's not democratic. But I think we need to make a very clear case. And your report actually helps us in that. And I will be sending it to all the members of the Constitutional Review Committee and the national, there's a group in Nigeria now doing something called Agenda 2050, the plan, medium-term development plan for the country. They need to see what you've been able to find out, which is that people's perceptions can be quite conservative, but with the right policies, you can actually prod the society ahead and get to equality, which is what we all want.
Hafsat, thank you so much, because we create evidence and data to provide the basis for good policy making. So it makes me feel really positive that you can see a route to that. So thank you, everyone, for your reflections from your own lived experiences in the countries in which you work and base your lives out of. And what I'd like to do now with the remaining 10 minutes is talk about some of the commonalities that come through in the Reykjavik Index. We see in every country we look at, we see some very similar themes, a difference between men and women, that women, whilst they are also prejudiced against female leadership to a less extent than men. And we've also seen this new finding across the G7 of younger people coming through as potentially, certainly this year, and with us needing to track this over time, as less progressive in this area than older people. So I'd be now, in the last 10 minutes, be really pleased to have your thoughts overall on global issues around gender inequality that we all share our focus on. Could I start with you, Dr. Sunami, and your thoughts on this issue of the cohort effect and time not necessarily going to drive this in the direction we'd want it to go?
I was very shocked to hear this from your index, and I discussed with my colleagues and some of the scholars that are working on this issue, and that was really shocking. And I just hope that this is not a real challenge to our democratic values, not just a gender issue, but the younger generation really cope dealing with this uncertainty in the world that are facing us, to come up and saying, there's this new idea, it's not a reflection of really a challenge to what the democracy that we think that should be there. And it is something that we need to take everybody together to address this as a not just issue of gender, but diversity, all sorts of fundamental of the democratic value. And I think we can really address this, a very important issue. And one of the things, of course, in our part of the world is to work, not just Japan, but look at the China, Korea, other Asian countries together to really talk about this. And I think to show the importance of the diversity and also the woman empowerment, the female leadership in the society as something that we can really be see that as a role model. And I think we are hoping to see this kind of collaboration because of this the challenge that we see in the fundamental of our democracy. So.
Thank you. And it is very sobering, and it also reminds us, children are not born with prejudice, and we're all complicit in the way that we raise the generation. And there's a lot really for us to address in terms of when we know the inequality and prejudice in society, why do we presume that they'll be able to throw that off without support? So it's a very important area. Hafsat, can I come to you? And one of the things the index does is it looks at differences across sectors, and it looks at areas where more progress has been made and where less progress has been made. There is so much to do. There are so many different areas where we can focus. How do you think, in terms of the areas where you work, do you focus on the areas where you think progress is already being made, where you can start to push faster? Or do you focus instead on the areas where there is even the more work to do?
I think that the most important is to focus on where the women are. Like in Africa, most of our food producers are women, and yet they're married in poverty because of obstacles to accessing assets like land and tools and training. And because there's so much in agriculture, if we could empower them there and empower them across the value chain of agriculture, it would be game-changing. And so I would focus on that. But I think also, coming back again to this issue of perception, power as perceived, Kamala Harris in the United States, now Vice President-elect of the United States, Black, Asian, female. It's powerful. And the CNN journalist who was reporting on this, she said, you know, our son came into the sitting room, he's 5 years old, and he looked at the television and he says, Mom, what's going on? And she said, those two people, that was Harris and Biden, are going to be the next leaders of our country. And the son looked at the mom and said, Mom, could you be the leader of our country? You know, children may, you know, I noted, Michelle, in the report that the child care service sector had one of the worst cases of perception for women in all the sectors. So these people are there rearing our little babies, our little children, our toddlers, and they're so biased against women's leadership. So obviously we're nursing these children in a stew of conservatism. So we shouldn't really be surprised if the results are saying what they are. And what we should be actively doing is looking for messaging, symbolism that interrupts discrimination and interrupts those kinds of perceptions, like the election of Kamala Harris, and like the fact that in Africa we have about 15 heads of state, prime ministers that have been women. We need to keep raising these issues and celebrating it, because that tells people that it is possible.
Thank you. And I think, you know, as I said when I was doing the presentation, I actually was there was something sad to reflect on, that I was sharing such, in many ways, sobering data after a weekend that has felt to have some triumphs for women in political leadership. Hiltrud, could I come to you now and from a very different perspective? You're one of the very few women to have ever reached the top of a global automotive company, and I know you also have put a lot of effort into being you've been a long-term advocate of women's rights. So just, if you don't mind me asking on a personal basis, how do we, as people who may have some degree of positional influence in corporations, in institutions, in the public sector, how do we focus on trying to improve the day-to-day experience that can challenge these prejudices that hold us back?
Yeah, first of all, it is my true belief that every woman that has, managed to put a crack into the glass ceiling also has the obligation to give their hand to other women and helping them to develop into that stage as well. So it always means for me that I have to do my job in the company, and at the same time, as you quite rightly said, be an advocate for women as well. I gave myself a personal target, and I said at least 5% of all working days will be dedicated 100% to female empowerment. That makes 15 days a year where I really put all my efforts in, and over the whole year, I'm working in mentorship programs and other means to help other women to see how they can, best let's say, survive in that world and even grow in that. So working with internal and external mentees is key for me, and resonating on what my two panel peers here said, I must say yes. If others are conservative and we are replicating the world that we live in, then we have to be stubborn in setting impulses for change as well. And I think this stubbornness will help our children to grow up in a different world. I don't want it to be that hard for my daughter, who is 22, when she finishes her degree.
Thank you, Hiltrud. You know what? I'm going to take a moment to say happy birthday to my daughter, who turned 18 today and who makes all of this very worthwhile. The clock has turned red, and I think if I now do unfortunately have to do what we're meant to do and wrap up on time. So let me say to Hiltrud Werner, Dr. Sunami, Hafsat Abiola, it's been an absolute pleasure. I would have liked to have been able to keep us talking all day. I think we've got time just to come back for literally 10, 20 seconds, no more, to each of you, just to hear about the things that you will be focusing on in the 12 months ahead as we all work together to address the prejudice in society that prevents men and women, actually, from operating with true equality, and for women sort of succeeding in what is their birthright. So if I can start with you, Hafsat, 10 seconds.
10 seconds, Michelle. I'm going to take your study and send it to the leaders of the 54 countries in Africa.
Thank you.
The letter that let's look at quotas, let's look at affirmative action, whatever we need to do to get women into government.
Perfect. Dr. Sunami.
Yes, our foundation, according to the index, are one of the good sector in our country for women's empowerment. And we wanted to educate other sectors to see that women leadership is something that is very valuable and something is real. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hiltrud, the clock's ticking. We're at 8 seconds. Yeah. Over to you.
I will come next year to Iceland, hopefully with good news about the advancement of more women in the automotive industry.
Thank you very much. So to my panel, thank you again, and to women political leaders, to everyone at Reykjavik. I wish we were there in person, but it's been wonderful to be part of it virtually. So thank you.